The grand hall of the Varanthi Senate stretched so far that Commander Ilara Voss could barely see the far wall, and every surface was covered in gold and crystal that reflected light in patterns she had never seen before on Earth or anywhere else humans had traveled. She stood near the back of the chamber in her simple dark gray uniform, while hundreds of alien delegates filled the curved seats above her, their voices echoing off the vaulted ceiling like the hum of 1,000 insects. And she kept her hands behind her back and her face perfectly still, because she had learned a long time ago that the quietest person in any room was usually the one paying the most attention. The Varanthi were impressive creatures, and she would not deny that, each one standing nearly 8 feet tall with iridescent scaled skin that shifted color depending on their mood, 4 powerful arms folded across their broad chests, and eyes like molten copper that seemed to look through you rather than at you. And every single one of them carried themselves with the kind of confidence that came from belonging to a civilization that had ruled the stars for 12,000 years. High Marshal Cathari Jal stood at the center of the Senate floor on a raised platform that glowed faintly beneath his feet, and his voice boomed through the chamber without any need for amplification, because the Varanthi had been engineered for command long before they ever built starships. "We welcome our newest provisional members," Jal said, and his 4 arms spread wide in a gesture that was supposed to be generous, but felt to Voss more like a predator showing you how big it was before it decided whether to eat you. "The humans of Sol have shown adequate development, and we grant them the honor of learning from the greatest military force this galaxy has ever known." A ripple of approval moved through the chamber, and Voss caught Ambassador Dren Halwick shifting uncomfortably beside her, his diplomatic smile locked in place like armor. And she knew he was thinking the same thing she was thinking, which was that the word adequate was doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. The military exchange program had been Halwick's idea, a way to get human officers embedded with Varanthi forces so that humanity could study their technology and tactics up close. And the Varanthi had agreed because they saw it the way a parent might agree to let a child watch them work, harmless and maybe even a little amusing. Voss had been selected for the program not because she was the most decorated officer in the fleet, but because she was the most patient one. And the brass back on Earth had decided that whoever they sent needed to be someone who could swallow their pride for months without cracking. And Ilara Voss had spent 3 combat tours lying motionless in mud and sand and snow waiting for a single perfect shot. So patience was something she understood better than most people understood anything. She boarded the Varanthi flagship Throne of Eternity the next morning, and it was like stepping inside a cathedral that someone had turned into a warship. Every corridor wide enough to drive a truck through, every surface polished to a mirror shine, and everywhere she looked there were Varanthi soldiers in gleaming armor that pulsed with energy shields built directly into the plating. They stared at her as she walked past, and she heard the whispers even though they probably thought she could not understand their language yet, and the translators in her earpiece caught every word. "That is the human officer, the one they sent to observe us. She is so small, how does she even carry a weapon? I heard humans still use projectile weapons, actual metal pieces fired from tubes, like something from a primitive age." Voss said nothing and kept walking. Sub-Commander Rylus met her at the officers' quarters, and he was younger than the others with scales that had not yet darkened to the deep blue of maturity. And unlike every other Varanthi she had met so far, he looked at her with genuine curiosity instead of thinly veiled contempt. "Commander Voss," he said, and dipped his head slightly, which she had learned was the Varanthi equivalent of a respectful nod. "I have studied your world's military history, and I find it fascinating. You have fought more wars among yourselves than most species fight in their entire existence." "We had a lot of practice," Voss said. Rylus made a sound that might have been a laugh and led her to her quarters, which were roughly the size of a closet compared to the Varanthi rooms, but she had slept in worse places. And she set down her gear and began memorizing the layout of the ship, because That was what she always did first in any new environment. The War Council happened 3 days later, and that was when things got interesting. High Marshal Jal had assembled his senior officers in a massive briefing room with holographic displays floating in the air showing fleet formations and planetary assault patterns. And Voss sat in a chair that was comically too large for her near the edge of the room, while the Varanthi discussed their military doctrine. It was impressive in its own way. She had to admit that. The Varanthi believed in overwhelming force applied with precision at a massive scale. Fleets of thousands of ships creating orbital superiority before dropping tens of thousands of heavily armored soldiers in coordinated waves supported by artillery platforms and energy bombardment from above. And every engagement was designed to crush the enemy so completely that resistance became mathematically impossible. Then Jal turned to the holographic display and brought up human tactical doctrine, and the mood in the room shifted from serious to amused. For the benefit of our guest and for the education of our officers, Jal said with a tone that was almost kind, which made it worse, let us review what our human allies consider military strategy. The display showed diagrams of camouflage techniques and concealment positions, and small unit tactics, and designated marksman operations, and guerrilla warfare patterns. And Voss watched the faces of the Varanthi officers as they processed what they were seeing. A senior general, whose name Voss had not bothered to learn, leaned forward and spoke with a voice dripping with disbelief. They dig holes in the ground and cover themselves with vegetation, and then they shoot one enemy soldier at a time. Is that correct? That is correct, Jal said. The room erupted in laughter that shook the walls, and one officer wiped his eyes with 2 of his 4 hands and said between breaths, "How adorable! They play hiding games and call it warfare." Another officer added, "1 soldier at a time. At that rate, a single Varanthi battalion could conquer their entire world before they finished their first engagement." Voss sat perfectly still through all of it, and her heartbeat never changed, and her expression never shifted, and Rylus, who was watching her from across the room, noticed that, and it made him uneasy in a way he could not quite explain, because he had seen predators sit that still before, and it was never a good sign. Jal eventually turned to her with what he probably thought was a generous smile, and said, "Commander Voss, would you like to offer any thoughts on how human tactics might complement our own?" Every eye in the room turned to her, and she could feel the weight of their amusement pressing down like gravity, and she stood slowly and looked up at creatures twice her size who commanded fleets that could crack planets, and she said in a voice that was calm and even and carried no anger at all, "Every empire, eventually, meets something it did not plan for." The room went quiet for just a moment, and then someone chuckled, and the moment passed, and they moved on to other business. But Rylus did not laugh, and he watched Voss return to her seat with the quiet efficiency of someone who never wasted a single movement, and he thought about what she had said, and he wondered what it would look like when an empire met something it had not planned for. He did not have to wonder long. The distress signal arrived 6 hours later, cutting through every channel on the ship like a knife through silk, and the holographic displays in the command center lit up red as the automated emergency broadcast played on repeat. Seraph IV was under attack, a border colony world with 40,000 Varanthi and human civilians. And the Vorak Dominion had come with a fleet and an army and the intention to take it by force. High Marshal Jal stood at the center of the command deck, and his scales had gone dark with fury, and he began issuing orders that set the entire flagship into motion, and Voss stood in the corner and watched and waited, because she had been waiting her whole life for moments exactly like this one, and she knew with a certainty that went deeper than thought that everything was about to change. The fleet dropped out of faster than light travel above Seraph IV, and the planet filled the viewport like a blue and green jewel wrapped in white clouds. And from up here it looked peaceful, but the sensor readings told a different story, because the Vorak Dominion had already landed over 20,000 soldiers on the surface, and their warships hung in orbit like dark blades waiting to cut anything that came too close. High Marshal Jal wasted no time, and within the first hour he had launched the Varanthi fleet into a full orbital engagement. Hundreds of warships surging forward in perfect formation with their shields blazing and their weapons cycling up to full power. And the space above Seraph IV became a storm of light and fire as plasma bolts and energy lances tore across the void. The Varanthi were good at this part, and Voss could see that clearly from the observation deck where she stood watching the battle unfold on holographic displays. Their fleet coordination was flawless, and their firepower was extraordinary. And within 6 hours they had pushed the Vorak fleet back far enough to establish orbital control over the northern hemisphere. Then came the ground assault, and that was where everything fell apart. Jal ordered 3 full battalions to deploy to the surface in heavy dropships, each one carrying hundreds of Varanthi soldiers in their gleaming powered armor with energy shields and plasma rifles, and the absolute confidence of warriors who had never learned what it felt like to lose. They landed in the valleys south of the main colony and formed up in their standard assault formations, long lines of armored soldiers advancing in coordinated waves with artillery support from mobile platforms behind them. And it looked magnificent on the tactical display, like a perfect machine rolling forward to crush whatever stood in its path. The forest of Seraph IV swallowed them whole. The Vorak had studied Varanthi tactics for decades, and they knew exactly what was coming, and they had prepared for it, with a patience that the Varanthi had never expected from what they considered a lesser species. And they had turned the dense mountain forests into a killing ground. The first ambush hit the lead battalion 17 minutes after they entered the tree line, and it came from everywhere at once, from above and below, and from angles that the Varanthi formation was not designed to handle, and the Vorak used signal jammers that cut communication between units, so that officers could not coordinate and soldiers could not call for support. Voss watched the casualty numbers climb on the display, and her jaw tightened, but her expression stayed controlled because she had seen this before. Not on this scale and not with aliens, but the pattern was the same. A technologically superior force walking into terrain. It did not understand against an enemy that had decided to fight on its own terms instead of the terms its opponent preferred. The gleaming Varanthi armor that looked so impressive on parade became a death sentence in the forests because it reflected light and emitted energy signatures that the Vorak could track from kilometers away. And the rigid formations that worked so well in open terrain became choke points in the narrow passes between the mountains where the Vorak had prepositioned kill zones. By the end of the first day, the lead battalion had lost 40% of its strength and had advanced less than 3 kilometers. Jal stood at the command table on the flagship, and his scales had gone pale, which Voss had learned meant cold fury, and he stared at the tactical display as if he could change the numbers through sheer willpower, and then he turned to his generals and said the words that Voss had been dreading. Send the second wave, double the force, increase artillery support by 300%. And Voss thought to herself that doing the same thing harder was not the same as doing something different, but she said nothing because she had not been asked, and because she knew that the Varanthi were not ready to hear what she had to say. Not yet. Not until the pain got bad enough. The second wave deployed the next morning with twice the soldiers and 3 times the firepower, and they pushed deeper into the forests. And they took ground, but they paid for every meter in blood. And the Vorak simply melted back into the terrain and reformed behind them and hit them from directions they had already cleared. Subcommander Rylas found Voss in the observation deck that evening, and he looked shaken in a way that a young officer looks when the invincibility he has believed in his whole life starts to crack. And he stood beside her and watched the casualty reports scroll across the display in silence for a long time before he spoke. "You are not surprised," he said. "No," Voss said. You have seen this before. Different planet, different enemy, same mistake. Rylus turned to look at her, and his copper eyes were searching for something, and he asked, "What would you do?" Voss looked at him for a moment, and then she said, "I would stop trying to win the war the Vorak want me to fight, and I would start fighting the war they are afraid of." She requested a meeting with Jal that night, and it went exactly as she expected. The High Marshal standing over her like a mountain with his arms crossed, and his voice carrying the particular sharpness of a proud leader who was losing, and did not want to admit it. "You wish to take a team to the surface," Jal said, and it was not a question. 12 operators, Voss said, "small enough to move without being detected, trained in the kind of warfare your soldiers were not built for." And what exactly would 12 humans accomplish that 6,000 Varanthi soldiers have not? "With respect, High Marshal, your 6,000 soldiers are trying to break down a wall by running into it. I am offering to find the door." Jal stared at her, and she could see him weighing his pride against his losses, and for a moment she thought he might actually listen. But then his scales flushed dark, and he said, "This is a war for soldiers, Commander, not for scouts." And he turned away, and the meeting was over. But Ambassador Halwick had been working channels that Jal did not know about, and by the next morning, Voss had authorization from the Joint Command Council to deploy a 12-person human special operations team to the surface under the official designation of Civilian Evacuation Support, which was a polite fiction that everyone understood and nobody challenged, because the politicians had decided that letting the humans try could not possibly make things worse than they already were. Voss selected her team from the human operators already stationed on the border fleet, and every single one of them was someone she had worked with before, people who understood that the loudest thing on a battlefield was usually the first thing to die. They dropped to the surface in a shuttle so small that the Varanthi sensors barely registered it, and they landed in the mountains 15 kilometers north of the main Vorak positions, and within an hour of touching ground, Voss had her team dispersed into the terrain in a way that made them effectively invisible. She did not attack, she did not advance, she did not do anything that the Varanthi would have recognized as military action. She watched. For 3 days she lay in positions that she changed every 8 hours, covered in local vegetation with her heat signature masked by thermal blankets and her electronic emissions reduced to zero. And she watched the Vorak through a scope that could count the scales on an alien face from 4 kilometers away. She mapped their patrol routes and timed their rotations and identified their communication patterns and cataloged their officers by rank and behavior. And she built a picture of the enemy that was more detailed than anything the Varanthi had managed to gather in a week of heavy combat. And then she found it, the weakness she had been looking for. The Vorak command structure was centralized in a way that was almost beautiful in its vulnerability. Each battalion depended on a single field commander for tactical decisions, and those commanders depended on a regional officer who reported directly to the fleet admiral. And if you remove the right pieces from that chain, the entire structure would collapse like a building, with its supports kicked out. Voss opened a secure channel to Rylus on the flagship and transmitted her analysis in a compressed data burst that lasted less than a second. "I found the door," she said. And then she began to plan. The first shot was fired at dawn on a Tuesday, and nobody heard it. That was the point. Commander Alara Voss lay on a ridge 1,600 meters above the Vorak forward operating base, in a position she had prepared over 2 days, scraping out a shallow depression in the rock and covering it with local brush and a thermal dampening blanket that made her body invisible to every sensor the Vorak had. And she controlled her breathing the way she had been trained to do since she was 22 years old, which meant her heartbeat was slower than most people achieved in deep sleep. Her rifle was a modified M97 railgun, a human weapon that the Varanthi had dismissed as a museum piece when they first saw it, and it fired a tungsten penetrator rod the size of a pencil at nearly 4 times the speed of sound, using magnetic acceleration with no chemical propellant, which meant no muzzle flash, no heat bloom, no smoke, and no sound that could be traced back to the shooter before the round had already arrived. The Vorak field commander named Draxus Vel was standing outside his command tent, reviewing a tactical display with 2 of his officers when the round hit him in the center of his chest, and passed through his body and buried itself in the ground 3 meters behind him, and he was dead before his legs finished buckling, and his officers stood frozen for 2 full seconds trying to understand what had just happened because there had been no warning, no energy weapon signature, no incoming fire alarm. Nothing. By the time they started shouting, Voss had already begun disassembling her rifle and packing her gear, because she never fired more than 1 shot from the same position, and she was moving to her next hide site 2 kilometers east before the Vorak even figured out which direction the shot had come from. She killed the 2nd field commander that afternoon from a position on the opposite side of the valley, and this one she took at 2,200 meters, which was a shot that required her to account for wind speed and air density, and the curvature of the planet and the rotation of Seraph IV itself. And she made the calculations in her head the way a musician reads notes, because she had been doing this long enough that the math had become instinct. The 3rd commander died the next morning and the 4th died that evening, and by the end of the 2nd day, the Vorak had lost 4 senior field officers, and they did not know how or from where or by whom, and the effect on their forces was exactly what Voss had predicted. Units that had been advancing with confidence began to hesitate. Patrols that had moved in predictable patterns started taking erratic routes, and communication traffic spiked as officers who were used to receiving clear orders from their commanders suddenly found themselves waiting for instructions that never came because the people who gave those instructions were dead. On the 3rd day, Voss killed 3 more commanders, including a regional officer named Sareth who had been coordinating the entire Western Front, and she took that shot at 3,400 meters, which was the longest kill she had ever made on any world, and she lay in her position for 6 hours afterward, without moving a single muscle, waiting for the search parties to pass below her before she crawled backward out of her hide and disappeared into the mountains like smoke. The Vorak soldiers began calling her the Ghost. They did not know she was human. They did not know she was a single person, and some of them believed she was a Varanthi secret weapon or a malfunction in their own equipment or a betrayal from within their ranks. And that uncertainty was almost as damaging as the kills themselves, because an enemy you cannot see and cannot understand becomes bigger in your mind than any enemy you can. Subcommander Rylus sat alone in the tactical analysis room on the throne of eternity and stared at the holographic map of Seraph IV with the kind of intensity that meant he was seeing something that nobody else had seen yet. And what he was seeing was a pattern. Every killed officer was a node in the Vorak command network, and the order in which they had been eliminated was not random. It was surgical. Each kill removed a specific link in the chain of command that created maximum disruption in a specific sector. And the overall effect was that the Vorak military structure on Seraph IV was being disassembled from the top down like someone pulling threads from a tapestry, until the whole picture fell apart. Rylus had studied human military history as a personal hobby, and he had read about snipers, and he had found them interesting in an academic way, the same way one might find a primitive hunting technique interesting. But seeing it applied in real time against a modern military force made something click in his mind that changed the way he understood warfare. He brought his analysis to High Marshal Jal and laid it out on the tactical display, and Jal looked at it for a long time in silence. "One human," Rylus said. "One human with a rifle has done more damage to the Vorak command structure in 3 days than our ground forces accomplished in a week." Jal said nothing for a while, and his scales shifted through colors that Rylus had never seen on him before, which meant the High Marshal was feeling something that did not have a simple name. "The advance has stalled," Zhao finally said. "Their entire western front has stopped moving." "Because there is no one left to give the orders," Rylus said. "She did not kill soldiers, she killed the mind of their army." Meanwhile, on the surface, Voss had begun the second phase of her operation, and while she continued her campaign of precision elimination, her team was working with a small group of Varanthi volunteers who had come down in the second wave and had survived long enough to understand that the old way was not working. Training the Varanthi in human tactics was like teaching a bear to be a cat. They were too big, too loud, too visible, and every instinct they had screamed at them that hiding was cowardice, and that a warrior should face his enemy in the open. But Sergeant Tomas Harlan, who was the most patient man on Voss's team, spent hours with them showing them how to use the terrain and how to mask their heat signatures, and how to move through forest without disturbing the canopy. "You do not have to stop being strong," Harlan told them. "You just have to learn to be invisible first and strong second." It was Rylus who translated not just the words but the concept for the Varanthi volunteers, explaining that concealment was not the opposite of courage, but an extension of it, that the discipline required to lie still for hours while your enemy walked past you within arm's reach was a kind of bravery that the Varanthi had simply never been asked to practice. And slowly, painfully, the Varanthi began to learn. They would never be as good as humans at this kind of warfare because their bodies were not built for it, but they did not need to be perfect. They just needed to be better than the Vorak expected, and that was a much lower bar. The chapter in this war was turning, and everyone could feel it. The Vorak advance had stopped, and their forces were pulling back into defensive positions, and their communication channels were full of confusion and fear. And the name that kept appearing in intercepted transmissions was not a name at all, but a description that translated roughly to the one who kills from nowhere. But the Vorak were not fools, and they had not built a dominion by surrendering to fear. And on the evening of the third day, Voss intercepted a transmission that made her go very still. The Vorak High Commander had issued an order to every unit on Seraph IV, and the words were simple and absolute. "Find the ghost, deploy the hunter-killer units, burn the mountains if you must, but find this thing and kill it. I do not care what it costs." Voss read the transmission twice, and then she looked out at the mountains that had been her home for 3 days, and she knew that the game had just changed because up until now she had been hunting, and from this moment forward she would also be hunted. She checked her rifle, and she checked her ammunition, and she checked the positions of her team members on her tactical display, and then she settled into her new hide site and slowed her breathing and waited, because that was what she did better than anyone else alive. She waited and she watched the tree line below her, and somewhere out there in the darkness the Vorak were coming for her, and she was not afraid because fear was a luxury that snipers could not afford, and besides she had been hunted before, and the hunters had always ended up the same way. Dead and confused about how it happened. The Vorak hunter-killer units arrived on the 4th morning in drop pods that screamed through the atmosphere like falling stars and slammed into the mountain slopes with enough force to split trees and scatter rock. And Voss counted 12 pods from her concealed position, which meant somewhere between 60 and 90 of the most dangerous soldiers the Vorak Dominion could produce were now in her mountains with one single purpose: kill the ghost. She had studied the Vorak hunter-killers in the intelligence briefings, and she knew what she was dealing with. They were augmented soldiers with enhanced senses and thermal tracking implants wired directly into their nervous systems, and they carried weapons designed for close-quarters combat in dense terrain. And each squad had an aerial drone that could scan wide areas for heat signatures and movement. And worst of all, each unit included a psionic scout, which was a Vorak born with the rare ability to sense the emotional signatures of living beings through some mechanism that human science still did not fully understand. The psionic scouts were the real threat because you could hide your heat, and you could silence your movement, and you could eliminate your electronic emissions, but you could not stop yourself from feeling. And fear and anger and focus all had signatures that a psionic could read like a beacon in the dark. But Voss had a theory about that, and it was a theory built on 20 years of training herself to become something that most people would find unsettling. Because when Alara Voss settled behind her rifle and entered what she called the stillness, she did not feel fear or anger or even focus in the way that normal people understood those words. She felt nothing at all except a perfect empty calm that was less like an emotion and more like the surface of a frozen lake. She would find out soon enough if that calm was quiet enough to fool a psionic. The first 2 days of the hunt were a chess match played across 30 square kilometers of mountain wilderness, and Voss played it the way she played everything, which was slowly and carefully, and with absolute control. She never stayed in one position for more than 4 hours. She moved only during the windows when the aerial drones were cycling through their scan patterns, and she had mapped those patterns within the first 6 hours. And she left false trails that led the hunter-killer squads into terrain where movement was difficult and sight lines were poor. She set up decoy positions using chemical heat packs buried under debris that gave off thermal signatures close enough to a human body to draw investigation. And when a Vorak squad moved in to check one of these decoys, they found nothing except a small device that Voss had built from salvaged parts that emitted a single burst of static on their communication frequency, which told them nothing useful, but made them waste 20 minutes running signal analysis. She was not just evading them, she was exhausting them, because every false trail and every decoy and every moment of confusion burned through their energy and their patience and their discipline. And tired soldiers made mistakes, and mistakes in the mountains meant death. On the second night, she killed the leader of the first hunter-killer squad from 1,100 meters, while he was setting up a forward observation post, and the shot came from a direction that his team had already cleared, which meant the ghost had somehow moved through their perimeter without triggering a single sensor, and that information spread through the Vorak communication network like poison. The second squad leader died the next morning, and this one Voss did not kill with her rifle. She killed him with an improvised explosive device made from a Vorak power cell that she had recovered from a destroyed supply drone and rigged to a tripwire made of monofilament wire so thin that it was invisible to the naked eye. And the explosion was small and precise, and it killed only the squad leader and wounded one other soldier, and the message it sent was clear. The ghost did not just shoot from far away. The ghost could reach out and touch you, and you would never see it coming. The remaining hunter-killer squads began to change their behavior in ways that Voss recognized because she had seen it before in every enemy she had ever faced, which was the transition from hunting to surviving. They stopped spreading out and started clustering together. They stopped advancing aggressively and started moving in cautious circles. They stopped looking for the ghost and started watching their own backs. Fear had entered the equation, and fear was the most powerful weapon a sniper had. But the psionic scouts were still out there, and on the morning of the 5th day, one of them found her. She was moving between positions through a narrow ravine when she felt something brush against her mind like a cold finger tracing the inside of her skull. And she knew instantly what it was because the briefings had described the sensation, and she dropped flat against the rock and entered the stillness as deep as she could go. It was not enough. The psionic was close, closer than she had expected, and he was good because he locked onto the faint residual trace of her awareness before she could fully suppress it, and she heard movement in the rocks above her, and she looked up and saw a Vorak standing on the ridge with his eyes glowing faintly purple, which meant his psionic ability was fully active, and he was looking directly at her. She shot him through the throat with her sidearm at 15 meters and he fell, and she was already running before his body hit the ground because, where there was a psionic there was a squad, and she could hear them crashing through the brush behind her. The chase lasted 11 minutes, and it was the most dangerous 11 minutes of her life, running through terrain she knew but not well enough, with augmented soldiers behind her who were faster and stronger and could see in the dark. and she took a plasma graze across her left thigh that burned through her thermal suit and seared the skin beneath, and the pain was extraordinary. But she had been trained to file pain in a box in the back of her mind and deal with it later. She lost them in a river gorge where the water noise and mineral content in the rocks scrambled their sensors, and she crawled into a crevice in the canyon wall and pressed her back against the cold stone and looked at her leg, which was burned badly enough that she could see muscle through the charred skin. She treated the wound with a field medical kit that included a coagulant spray and a local anesthetic and a bandage that was designed to mask heat signatures. And she did all of this in the dark by touch because she could not risk a light. And when she was done, she leaned her head back against the rock and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds to feel the pain before she put it back in the box and started planning her next move. Meanwhile, on the flagship, Rylus had convinced High Marshal Jal to try something that the Varanthi military had never attempted before, which was a coordinated assault, timed to coincide with Voss's operations. And Jal had agreed not because he had suddenly developed faith in human tactics, but because his own tactics were failing, and he was running out of options, and even an empire's pride has limits when the bodies start piling up. The plan was simple in concept and brutal in execution. Voss and her team would identify and eliminate the Vorak forward observers and anti-air commanders in a specific sector, and then Varanthi heavy armor would advance through the gap before the Vorak could reorganize. Voss received the plan on her secure channel, and despite the pain in her leg and the exhaustion in her bones, she smiled, because this was the first time the Varanthi had asked humans for help, not as a token gesture, but as a genuine tactical necessity. The coordinated assault launched at dawn, and it worked better than anyone except Voss had expected. Her team eliminated 6 key targets in the first 90 minutes, and the Varanthi armored units rolled through the gap like a river through a broken dam, and the Vorak lost 3 defensive positions in a single day, which was more ground than the Varanthi had gained in the entire previous week. High Marshal Jal stood on the command deck and watched the tactical display update in real time, and the room was silent around him, and he said quietly to Rylus in a voice that carried the weight of a man whose understanding of the universe had just shifted beneath his feet. "She is not a scout, she is a weapon I did not understand." And Rylus nodded and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the results had not already said louder than any words could. On the surface, Voss checked her ammunition count and found she had 11 rounds left, and her leg was throbbing beneath the bandage, and she had not slept more than 2 hours in the last 3 days, but the Vorak were retreating, and the combined human and Varanthi approach was working, and for the first time since she had landed on this planet, she allowed herself to think that they might actually win this thing. She settled into her next position and raised her rifle and looked through the scope at the world below her and waited, because the war was not over yet, and the hardest part was still coming. The Vorak made their last stand in the capital city of Sci-Fi, a sprawling settlement built in the shadow of a mountain where 40,000 civilians had sheltered in underground bunkers while the war raged above them. And the Vorak had fortified every street and every building and every intersection with the desperate efficiency of an army that knew it was losing, and had decided that if it was going to fall, it would make the enemy bleed for every step. But what changed everything was the arrival of Admiral. He was the supreme commander of the entire Vorak invasion force, and he had been directing the battle from orbit until now. But with his ground forces crumbling and his field commanders dead or demoralized, he made the decision to descend to the surface personally to take direct command and rally his soldiers. And he established his command post in a reinforced bunker beneath the colony's administrative center, with energy shields layered so thick that an orbital strike would barely scratch the surface. Varanthi intelligence confirmed his location within hours, and the news rippled through the command structure of the Throne of Eternity like electricity, because everyone understood what this meant. Vorthax was the brain of the entire operation, and if they could remove him, the Vorak force would collapse, but the bunker was buried under 30 meters of rock and wrapped in shields that could absorb the combined firepower of a battle cruiser. Jal stood at the command table and stared at the holographic representation of the bunker and the shields and the layers of defense surrounding it, and he ran every scenario his tactical computers could generate, and every single one came back the same way. A direct assault on the bunker would cost between 3,000 and 8,000 Varanthi lives with no guarantee of success. The room was silent, and Jal's officers looked at each other and at the display, and at the floor, and nobody had an answer because the Varanthi way of war did not have a solution for this problem that did not involve unacceptable losses. It was Rylus who spoke first, and he said only 2 words. "Ask Voss." Jal looked at him, and something passed between them that was not quite agreement but was close enough. And 20 minutes later Voss was on a secure channel from her position in the mountains, with the tactical data streaming to her field display. She studied the bunker specifications for a long time, the shield layers and their power systems and their cycling frequencies, and the terrain around the administrative center, and the sight lines from every elevated position within 5 kilometers, and she asked questions that the Varanthi intelligence officers found strange because she was not asking about troop strength or weapon systems. She was asking about timing. "The shields," she said, "they cycle down during communication bursts. How long and how often?" The intelligence officer checked and came back with the answer. The shields dropped for 1.3 seconds every hour when the bunker transmitted a compressed data burst to the remaining Vorak ships in orbit. And during that window, there was a gap in the shield geometry on the eastern face approximately 40 centimeters wide, where the communication array needed a clear line to the sky. 1.3 seconds, a 40-centimeter gap, and she would need to fire from a position 3.8 kilometers away, because that was the only elevated terrain with a line of sight to the eastern face that was not covered by Vorak anti-sniper positions. And she could not see the target directly because Vorthax was inside the bunker, so she would need to calculate his position based on thermal bleed data coming through the walls and predictive modeling of where he would be standing based on the layout of the command room. Rylus listened to her analysis and then asked the question that everyone was thinking. "Can you make that shot?" Voss was quiet for a moment, and in that silence was the weight of every shot she had ever taken, and every hour she had spent learning to do something that most people considered impossible, and she said, "I need to see the terrain. I need 6 hours to prepare. And I need the Varanthi to launch a diversionary assault on the western perimeter at exactly the right moment to keep every eye pointed the wrong direction." "That is not a yes," Rylus said. "It is the only answer that matters," Voss said. She moved through the night like water flowing downhill, silent and inevitable, and she reached her chosen position before dawn, a rocky outcrop on a ridge that overlooked the city from the east, and she spent 4 hours preparing the site, clearing her sight line by millimeters, building a wind reading station from sensor equipment her team had carried up the mountain, and calculating the shot over and over until the numbers were burned into her mind. The railgun rifle was clean and calibrated, and she had 1 round loaded and 2 spares, and her leg was pulsing with pain beneath the bandage. But she pushed it down into the box and closed the lid, and there was nothing left in her mind except the math and the wind, and the target she could not see. The diversionary assault began at exactly 1400 hours, and the Varanthi threw everything they had at the western perimeter with armored vehicles and infantry and air support, and the Vorak responded by pulling every defender to the western wall, and for a few critical minutes, the eastern face of the bunker was as quiet as it was ever going to get. Voss watched the clock on her display counting down to the next communication burst, and she controlled her breathing until her heart was beating once every 3 seconds, and the crosshairs of her scope were centered on the 40-centimeter gap that would exist for 1.3 seconds, and the thermal overlay showed a heat signature inside the bunker that her predictive model placed at the position where Vorthax would be standing when the burst initiated. The clock reached 0. The shields flickered. She fired. The tungsten rod crossed 3.8 kilometers in just under 3 seconds, and it passed through the 40-centimeter gap with 12 centimeters to spare, and it entered the bunker through the communication array housing, and it struck Admiral Vorthax in the upper chest and killed him instantly. 1 round, 1 kill, from a distance that the Varanthi tactical computers later classified as beyond theoretical maximum effective range for any known infantry weapon in the Galactic database. The effect was immediate and total. The Vorak command network went dark within minutes as officers waited for orders that would never come, and units that had been fighting with desperate coordination began to fragment and collapse inward. And within 6 hours, the organized resistance on Seraph IV had ended, and Varanthi forces moved through the city accepting surrenders from Vorak soldiers, who had simply stopped fighting, because the mine that held them together was gone. Seraph IV was free. The aftermath unfolded over the following weeks in ways that Voss had not anticipated, because she was a soldier and not a politician, and she had not understood how deeply her actions would reshape the political landscape of the galaxy. High Marshal Jal convened a special session of the Galactic Senate, and the chamber was packed with delegates from every member species, and Jal stood at the center of the floor, where he had once introduced humans as provisional members with adequate development, and his voice, when he spoke, carried a gravity that silenced every whisper in the room. "We built an empire on the assumption that war is won by the greatest force," he said, and his 4 arms were still at his sides, which for a Varanthi was the posture of absolute sincerity. "The humans reminded us that war is won by the smartest force. We mocked them for hiding in dirt. We laughed at their primitive weapons. We dismissed their tactics as the strategies of a species that had not yet evolved beyond crawling on its belly through mud." He paused and looked across the chamber at the hundreds of faces watching him. "We will never make that mistake again." He formally requested that human tactical doctrine be integrated into the core Varanthi military curriculum, and the motion passed unanimously, which had not happened in the Senate on any military matter in over 2,000 years. The ceremony for the Varanthi Star of Eternity was held on the flagship, and it was the highest military honor the Empire could bestow, and it had never been given to anyone who was not Varanthi in the 12,000-year history of the award. And Voss stood on the platform in her simple gray uniform among officers who towered over her by 3 feet, and she accepted the medal with a nod. And when Jal asked if she would like to address the assembly, she looked out at the room full of giants and spoke in a voice that was calm and even and carried no pride at all. "Where I come from we have a saying, 1 shot, 1 kill. You do not need to burn a world to win a war. You just need to know where to aim." The room was silent, and then Rylus began to clap, which was a human gesture he had learned, and did not come naturally to someone with 4 hands, but he managed it, and then others joined, and the sound filled the chamber. In the weeks that followed, military academies across the galaxy began requesting access to human tactical archives, and the words asymmetric warfare and force multiplication and designated marksman entered the vocabulary of species that had never needed them before, and the Vorak Dominion quietly updated their strategic threat database with a new entry under the species classification for humans. The entry read, "Do not engage at range, do not assume you are unseen, do not assume you are safe." Rylus was promoted to full commander and given authority to build the first joint human Varanthi Special Operations Division, and he chose as his co-commander a human officer who he had come to respect more than anyone he had ever served with. And when he offered her the position, she accepted without hesitation, because there were always more battles, and the galaxy was vast and dangerous, and somebody needed to teach these aliens how to fight smart. Voss shipped back to Earth for 3 weeks of medical leave, and she spent most of it sitting on the porch of her family's house in Montana, watching the mountains and drinking coffee and letting her leg heal. And on the last evening before she left again, her mother asked her what it was like out there among all those alien civilizations. Voss thought about it for a while, and then she said, "They are very impressive and very powerful and very old, and they had forgotten something important that we never forgot." "What is that?" her mother asked. "That the most dangerous thing in the universe is not the biggest thing," Voss said. "It is the thing you never see coming." She returned to the stars the next morning, and the galaxy watched her go with new eyes, because humanity had arrived not as the strongest species, or the most advanced, or the most numerous, but as something that every great empire in history had learned to fear. The ones who fight differently. And that difference was terrifying,